I'm Laisha Palin. I'm Kate Starbird's advisor, and I'd like to welcome you to her final defense of her Ph.D. We're really very proud that she has reached this moment, but not surprised in any way. Before we formally begin with her talk, I'll give a little background bio of her academic career. Kate received her bachelor's degree in computer science from Stanford in 1997. Is that right? Okay. And then she joined Atlas 10 years later in 2007. Since being here, she has received an NSF graduate research fellowship, very prestigious fellowship. And she's authored, I went and did a quick count on her CV, about 14 or so papers and book chapters with co-authors, many of which of these papers she's first author on. 2 of these papers received a Best Paper nomination, one at the CHI conference, for those of you who know about CHI and CCW. These are really competitive conferences where a Best Paper nomination is a real honor, so we're proud of that for her. She has, let's see, and, here's the other big piece of news. I forgot to write it down, but she has accepted a position at the University of Washington as an assistant professor in the Human-Centered Design and Engineering program or department in the College of Engineering. So we're very, very proud of that as well. So we have 5 committee members here, one who is remote. Those include myself, John Bennett, Michelle Jackson, and Clayton Lewis. I know your name. Clayton Lewis. And Ed Hutchins is currently on Skype with a backup of the telephone in case we lose our Skype connection. And he's at UCSD in the Cognitive Science Department. So thank you, Ed, for coming online today. Okay, did you hear that? Okay, good. Just want to make sure he's that good. Okay. So the way we're going to run this next hour, let me double check the time. We're running 7 minutes late, so we're going to start now because we want to give Kate enough time. But we'll still finish before 2 o'clock for those of you who need to run off to some other meeting. So the committee agreed that we will give Kate 15 minutes for her talk. It's a little longer than we usually do. And the reason why is because in the job talks that she recently gave, she gave 2 very different job talks for 2 different audiences. One for a human-centered technology and society sort of information program, and one for a computer science program. So there's a lot of material there, and she still won't get to it all. But we thought 15 minutes would give her a better chance of giving a sense to us of the range of that material. So Kate, you'll have 50 minutes or so. I think you're preferring that we don't ask questions, or at least many questions, during the talk. We're going to try to get you through it, right?
Yeah, please.
And then what we'll do is what is traditional for those of you who are new to PhD defenses. The committee will ask their questions first. They want to challenge the candidate. So we challenge the candidate first, and then we'll see what we need there for time. But we need to give an appropriate amount of time for that. And then with the remaining questions, the audience can then ask the questions. At some point, the committee might have to excuse itself. You may continue asking questions if there are many more questions to ask, or you can start drinking coffee and tea and eating things with Kate, whatever you decide. And the committee will convene in one of the rooms for a conversation. Okay? So that's the part we have to play by ear. All right, Kate Starbird.
Oh, I was just getting up to make sure this was on. So thank you, Laisha, for that introduction. And I am going to jump right in because, oops, we did not do one thing right.
I forgot about that.
Nope,
Sorry.
I forgot it too.
Okay.
But as Laisha said, I'm presenting my PhD dissertation research, and the title of that is called Crowdwork, Crisis, and Convergence: How the Connected Crowd Organizes Information During Mass Disruption Events. And I'm going to jump right in. So my research lies at this intersection of social computing and mass disruption events. And by social computing, this is actually a big term, but it includes things like social media, computer-mediated communication, as well as the interaction and collaboration that those tools are enabling. And I study this in the context of mass disruption events. Mass disruption is a term we've given to events that are large-scale events that cause disruption to normal social routines. So events like natural disasters, mass emergencies, extreme weather events, as well as we're including protests and riots and things as well. So related to that, there's this long-standing finding in sociology of disaster that says after a disaster event, people will converge physically onto the scene of event to, among other things, offer help. And part of that is spontaneous volunteerism, although there are other components before, but you may have heard of this thing of spontaneous volunteers. And so what we've been seeing over the last few years is that people are now using social media to converge digitally onto the scene of disasters, where they meet for a variety of different reasons. And this convergence behavior, just to give you a picture of some of what it looks like in terms of volume, Project Epic here, my colleagues here, collected over 3 million tweets in a short period after the Haiti earthquake, is about 2.5 weeks, from over 800,000 different Twitterers, so people contributing to this very large data set. Similarly, after the Japan earthquake in 2011, it's been reported that there were dozens of Facebook posts posted every second for a period that was right after the quake. And in an event that probably none of you remember, I was collecting data this past spring, and during some, relatively speaking, pretty small tornadoes, I was picking up 800 tweets per minute. So there's a lot of volume, and it keeps growing. There's a lot of opportunity that we see for social computing in this space of mass disruption events. There's a new opportunity for citizen reporting where people are newly enabled to report information from the ground with their mobile phones or other devices, and maybe share that information with their peers or with response agencies. And there's a lot of potential for increasing our overall situational awareness of what's going on during an event with these new tools. There's also opportunity for responders and other agencies to communicate with people who are affected through social media and other tools. But there are a lot of challenges with this as well, a lot related to digital convergence. And one of those is that volume I was talking about with all that information. How do we sift through it? Within that volume, there's this problem that there's a lot of noise. So a lot of that information, very small portion of that information is relevant and going to be useful in this situation. And in fact, a lot of it is just repeat information that we've seen before. There's also this problem of lost context, where information loses a connection to the person who initially sent it, the time it was sent, or the location it's about, and that can cause some confusion. Related to that, misinformation and disinformation is a problem. And finally, of real interest in my research is the nature of the data is that it's unstructured. And what I mean by that is that it's not in a format that we can easily pick up and put together, classify, and look at. So a database is structured information, and what we have in tweets and Facebook messages are unstructured. So I started with this question in the back of my mind. I was doing some of the early research that we were doing here on Twitter, during Twitter use during disaster. I started thinking, well, how can we extract useful information from these social media updates? So how do we take all this information flowing through these channels, somehow process it, and create resources that affected people or responders could use? And to give away a lot of my talk and a lot of my findings from the beginning, what I ended up finding was that the crowd is already working to organize information in a variety of different ways. So the crowd, these digital convergers, are actually working to help. In some of those ways, we have digital volunteers, so people who are intentionally trying to offer assistance during disaster events in a variety of different ways. We're seeing emergent response organizations where people are using social media to connect to each other and coordinate their responses through those tools. Related to that, we're seeing ongoing virtual volunteer organizations where groups of people are creating these groups where they go from disaster event to disaster event and try to continue helping in different ways. And finally, I've been thinking about this idea where, in fact, every member of the crowd is actually working to organize the space. So all of this activity, those hundreds of thousands of tweets or those millions of tweets, are actually in some ways helping to organize the space. And we can maybe devise ways of leveraging that ambient work as well and making sense of it. So I give a new term to this, and I'm going to introduce it here, and I'm going to call it crowd work throughout this talk. And I've been asked a lot of times what I mean by crowd, and I'm going to tell you about that right now, so we just get that out of the way. Actually, I don't want to be there yet. But when I talk about crowd, it's not one of size, because clearly, even in these examples, we've got a couple digital volunteers, maybe a group of 5 working together, or thousands of people working together. So it could be one person, it could be a million. So for me, the word crowd doesn't mean size. For me, I'm talking about the audience of the event. So crowd work for me is the work by the audience of the event, the work by the digital convergers. And this is also the crowd, not coincidentally, of crowdsourcing, which is a term that's popular in our space, popular in other domains as well, for different kinds of crowd work. But I'm going to resist this term for a couple of reasons and unpack it and offer some alternative perspectives for examining this phenomenon. To give you a brief outline of this talk, you've just seen the introduction. I'm going to move on to talking now of 4 different studies of crowd work that I've done and how they relate to different research questions, and I'm going to take you through a trajectory of the research. I want to point out that many of these, all of these studies were completed with collaborators and have been previously published in some form, although in this talk and in my dissertation, I offer some extensions and I build towards new findings. And those I'll talk about as we get towards the end of the talk, when I talk about crowd work and offer new perspectives for examining it. And finally, I'll, if I have time, do a brief conclusion, which I will probably fly through, I have to admit. All right, so getting started, I'm going to take you back a few slides, but I started with this question in the back of my mind. So how do we extract information from social media updates? And I had this in mind. And very early on, I started to focus on the Twitter platform for a variety of reasons, not only because it's easy to study, but it definitely is, but there's a lot of other features of Twitter which make it an interesting tool in the crisis space. One is the fact that almost all tweets are public. They're also searchable through a variety of APIs, as well as by people through online tools that are readily available. It's a social network where people have connections, and we can get data about those connections, which can be interesting. It enables real-time communication. We've seen a great deal of adoption in the crisis context, where the people that are doing this kind of work, this digital volunteerism work I'll talk about, are using this tool. And also there's a few user-driven linguistic conventions that make the platform interesting. They also factor in they factor into my work. And I'm going to take you through a quick refresher of these. I know a lot of you have seen this before, but there's 3 things I want to tell you that people can do on Twitter. So Twitter are these really tiny 140-character tweets. And people have developed this way of adding their own metadata to the tweet into the text. So they add these thematic keywords to the text to tell other people what they're talking about. And in this case, and they do that with the # and then they put the term, and that gives others an idea of what they're talking about. Twitterers also use this addressed tweet concept, where they can send a tweet to another person directly, and they do this with a little @ symbol and then the name of the person, and that calls that tweet to the attention of someone else who's on Twitter. And you actually, to do that, you don't have to have a pre-existing connection. You can do that to someone. I can send a tweet to Justin Bieber if I want to. And then finally, there's the retweet, which is an extension of the address tweet, which is this. They do this RT @ symbol. Then you put the name of a person, and it's actually a forwarding mechanism where you cite the person who sent the message initially, and then you send it out again. So you rebroadcast the information. And this one factors in hugely to this research, so we're going to see that a lot. So stepping back, I'm trying to figure out ways of processing Twitter into useful resources. And initially, I was looking at this idea of using computational solutions. And a lot of people are looking at those, including people in our own lab, have been thinking about strategies like natural language processing and other computational approaches, machine learning approaches. And I was figuring out pretty early on, I guess in 2009, that this was hard. There's a lot of people working on it, but it's a hard computational problem. And so what I did was I went back and I tried to see if we could change the question. I asked if we could shift the burden of interpretation from the technology onto the users and teach people to make their tweets machine readable. And that becomes the question that powers the first study here, the Tweak the Tweet study. And I'm going to jump right into talking about Tweak the Tweet. So Tweak the Tweet was an idea I had. I came up with, I was working with another researcher at the Random Hacks of Kindness hackathon in November 2009. And I had this idea where we could extend the use of the hashtag and have people put hashtags in certain places in their tweets to basically tell a computer exactly what they're talking about, or maybe talk in a computer language. So we get people to structure the tweet so the computer could easily read it. So basically teaching people how to make tweets machine readable. And we had this idea we would use prescriptive tweeting to do it. We would send these tweets out into the space after an event, and people somehow would see the tweet, and we would tell them what format to use, and people would see this format, and they'd somehow be able to put their tweets into that format, and then computers could pick up the tweets and sort them all. It turned out to be very naive. I'll talk a little bit about that later, but I ended up building an infrastructure to support Tweak the Tweet, where I collect a bunch of tweets. I collect every tweet that's happening during an event. I process it. I put it into records. So if it's a Tweak the Tweet tweet, I process it into a record. I provide a public spreadsheet where people can see a record of that tweet, so what it's about, who sent it, what time they sent it, what location it was at, what the contact information was. And then I provide a map with that colors the different tweets by what they're about and puts them on a map according to the location that they had in their text. So we end up deploying Tweak the Tweet for more than 30 events with the help of my colleagues here at Project Epic, often all of us working together in madness, deploying it, sending out prescriptive tweets for over 30 events between 2010 and today. My dissertation document talks a lot about those different deployments, but it turns out to be the lessons learned from our very first deployment become the major discovery that develops into this larger research effort. And so I'm going to switch to just talking about that deployment here. So the Haiti earthquake struck Haiti, a catastrophic earthquake struck Haiti on January 12, 2010. And it created a huge humanitarian need in the aftermath of that quake. And it's actually noted by many now to have sparked a turn in humanitarian response towards recognizing a role for social media and digital volunteers. It wasn't the first time that we've seen digital volunteerism, but it's the first time that people really started to take note in the humanitarian response community. We deployed Tweak the Tweet on January 14th, so a couple days later. At this time, we already knew people weren't actually, very few people were using Twitter from the ground in Haiti at that time. And I get these 15 seconds back. Okay, so very few people were using Twitter at that time, but we thought that it might be useful to humanitarian responders or others, and we had this idea maybe people on the ground could use it. So what ends up happening is we deploy it. As we're deploying it, we collect all the tweets of anybody who sent a tweet in our format. We would collect their tweet, and then we would capture all the tweets of that user from January 14th to February 1. So what we did, we ended up capturing all these people, and this is kind of important because I'll keep citing this data set over and over again. But so anyone who ever sent a Tweak tweet, we captured all of the tweets they sent, not just the Tweak tweet or not just their Haiti tweets, but every tweet they sent between January 14th and February 1st, 2010. Turns out to be 339 Twitterers and almost 300,000 tweets. And what we found, perhaps not surprisingly, it probably shouldn't surprise us, total of four people sent Tweak the Tweet tweets from the ground. They sent a total of 10 tweets about their needs from the ground. And it turns out it is hard to teach people to think and tweet like a computer, which should not have been surprising. But what was surprising was this other finding. We ended up finding 74 people in this set weren't in Haiti at the time. They were remote. They were somewhere else on the planet, connected through social media, and they ended up translating tweets into the syntax. So they took information that they found on Twitter or somewhere else, and then they would put it into the syntax for us. And then they would retweet it out so our computers could pick this up. And they ended up sending over 1,000 different translated tweets. So they sent more, but they translated for the first time 1,000 different tweets. There was also retweets of these as well. So this ends up permanently changing our user scenario for Tweak the Tweet. So we went from thinking of, okay, we'll have this affected person who's using it, to, okay, this is going to be used by remote volunteers. And to this day, that's how I deploy Tweak the Tweet. I help volunteers translate information into the format. Change the research question from can we teach people to whom can we teach to do this and how can we teach them. It also opens up a new line of research for us, because as we went through those tweets and I started looking at those tweets from all of those people who had sent a Tweak tweet, which included people who just retweeted one, so it's just this big group of people who were interested. We looked through all of that information and we ended up finding that Tweak the Tweet was, the translation activity was only a small part of really diverse digital volunteer activity. And in that way, Tweak the Tweet became a portal to crowd work. And this led to new questions. And this sends me off on the rest of this research effort. And so I began to ask, so we have these people who are translating, but they're also doing this other stuff. So who are these people and what are they doing? How are they doing it? And why are they doing it? And so that became the founding question for the Voluntweeters study, which is study 2 in this research. Voluntweeters were named that they gave themselves. A lot of these people that were tweeting, and again, they weren't just translating tweets, they're doing a lot of different things. And we, again, used the same Twitter data collection from the Tweak the Tweet study. And then we went back and we managed to interview 19 Tweak the Tweet translators to understand some of their observations about and stories about what they were doing and why. And here is an interview quote from one of those Voluntweeters on how she got started in the space. "I think that's when I went on Twitter and started tweeting. Then I discovered a whole bunch of people tweeting for Haiti and started doing it myself and building up connections as much as I could in order to try to save some lives if possible." So this is interesting because for all the interview respondents in our study, Twitter was the portal for their activities. They didn't, before they knew what they were going to do, they didn't think of themselves as volunteers, many of them yet, but they had this tool and they were going to try to use it any way they could. And so they went on Twitter, they made some connections with people, they saw what other people were doing, or they saw an opportunity, and they started trying to fill that by doing different kinds of work. And I'm going to talk to you here about what kind of work this was. So we know that they were Tweak the Tweet translating. We know that's one of the things they were doing. But a core part of their activity, and often the first thing they did, was this, and it's going to show up again and again in this talk, is identifying and amplifying actionable information. And I'm going to show you a little example about what I mean by that. So Mark Ruin is a guy who was in Haiti during the earthquake, and he was on the ground there after the quake. And he tweets out this tweet that says he's heard about some child trafficking that's happening at a certain hospital. And this is at a time, January 26, 2 weeks after the event, where child trafficking had become very something that the media was talking about a lot, and digital volunteers were talking about a lot as well. And so within 2 hours, actually 15 of these are in 1 hour, but within 2 hours, 16 authors in our set, which is actually a very small subset, 339 Twitterers of people who were tweeting during Haiti, 16 of the authors retweeted that information. So they passed it on to their followers. And this is one example of hundreds of different pieces of information like this that the volunteers would then rebroadcast. And in our interviews, they told us why they were doing this. One said, "I wanted to pass around information I thought was relevant." It turns out that retweeting is very easy to do. The retweet functionality is now built into the Twitter platform. You can just push a button and retweet, so it's very fast. So for many Voluntweeters, this was their entryway to that activity. It was like, oh, I see good information, I'm just going to retweet it. This second quote is important too, especially as we think about, it's important as we go on. We'll see this again and again too. "I quickly identified the sources of good information, the people who meant well but got tricked by hoaxers and tricksters, and the people actually in Haiti, both locals, journalists, and aid workers." So this activity shows up over and over again. Volunteers searching for Twitter, trying to look for good information, people on the ground, sources they could trust, and then trying to rebroadcast or amplify that information and push it out to more people. Another activity that Voluntweeters began to do was routing information. They began to try to find response agencies that they thought could help, and they tried to send information that they were seeing directly to those agencies. These are two examples from that same incident of about a couple dozen of people trying to send that information to certain groups. So Red Lion tries to send it to Navy News because they knew the U.S. Navy had people on the ground, and Ms. Bell tries to send it to Team Rubicon, which was an NGO who had people on the ground in Haiti at the time. And they told us why they were doing this. By searching Twitter and finding these people, we could send them details on where to go and who needed what, if we saw that they were headed to a particular area. So this public nature of Twitter enabled Twitterers to find these organizations. They could look through the streams of organizations and see who had people on the ground in Haiti and even what part of Haiti they were in. And so they could find people and try to send information to them. And they could connect with them. Even if they hadn't had a pre-established connection, they could easily find these people and send information to them, or trying to get information closer to the people who could use it. A third just major activity the Voluntweeters kept telling us about in the interviews was how important verifying information became. And some Voluntweeters went as far as calling phone numbers that they saw in tweets of people on the ground in Haiti to confirm that they needed what they needed and that they were where they were, or where they said. In this next quote, one of the Voluntweeters tells us about that activity. And this quote tells us more as well because it reveals it exposes how a practice of voluntweeting was emerging among these different these different actors in the space. This woman says, crisis tweeting is an art, really. This is a few months after they'd ceased to be so active in Haiti, but you see her recognizing that this activity is something. This is something we do. It's volunteering or it's crisis tweeting. Accuracy can mean the difference between life and death for the people directly affected. That's why we ask that people not retweet information that they haven't confirmed. And so you can see not only that she says that we have to verify, but we started to teach other people to verify too. We started to shape the behavior of others. She said sometimes during Haiti, people would tweet info or urgent needs like someone trapped, and it was several days old. People want to help, but they don't appreciate that they may cause harm. Well, it's interesting because a lot of these, you can see this reflection going on. A lot of these volunteers started out themselves just blindly retweeting. Oh, retweet that, and then they were like, wait a minute, we have to confirm the time. This is 5 days old. This is bad information. And so you can see a structure for their work emerging, and you can see through their interactions with each other and their interactions within the constraints of the technology, these relationships. So the loss of context that happens on Twitter when you retweet, in this case, they lose the time, makes this rule about confirming information, or confirming the time of information necessary. And so this rule then becomes part of a shared understanding of what the practice of crisis tweeting is. And this is this emerging practice that actually relates to the technology constraints. So you can see how all these three things are related. And I'll talk a little bit about structuration as we go. I won't have a lot of time to get to the underlying things, but I'm going to try to expose it through how I talk about it. Another important aspect of volunteering was this connecting behavior. In the beginning, I worked alone. I started recognizing people who seemed to have good info, and we would support each other, retweet each other, and help find info for each other. And through this, they began to make connections. And in fact, when we take a network graph of all the all of the translators, this is anyone who translated a tweet, you get this pretty dense graph. You have 4 people that translated tweets in isolation, but the rest of them really started to connect with each other, and the group is pretty dense. And we actually were interested in this, so we went back and we asked each of the 19 people we managed to interview that are in this network, we asked them how many people, I forgot one part. These connections aren't friend-following relationships. They're actually people talking to each other. And the line thickness is how many times they were talking to each other. So some of these lines are quite thick because they were talking to each other a lot. So we asked them how many people in this network they knew before the earthquake. And so 3 people of the 19 we interviewed said they knew one other person in this network prior to the Haiti earthquake. We can extrapolate this out. You can check my math later. But that means that 10 or 11 of these connections pre-existed the Haiti earthquake. And the rest of these connections emerged after the quake. And so this is what's known as an emergent organization. And we can also, again, see this relationship between technology and the social structure that's emerging. And I want to stick with this, have you stick with me here because this is new for me. So the social media enables these connections due to the public nature of tweets and the non-reciprocal ties. And then in this case, all of these actions of the digital volunteers, the retweeting behavior, the mentions, the directing tweets around, even the adding a hashtag to make things more searchable, these became catalysts for making these connections. In many ways, these activities were the connections. And so you can see this practice of crisis tweeting and the actions that the people took actually relate to how this structure emerged and even what it looked like afterwards. So I'm going to move here from talking about, I'm going to move here with the volunteers from talking about volunteers to talking about this group called Humanity Road. Humanity Road becomes the focus of my next study, but to describe a little bit about who they are, Humanity Road is a virtual volunteer organization, but they actually emerged from the volunteers. A small subset of the volunteers actually, they didn't break away because they stayed in that network, but they began to form their own organization and they formalized as a 501(c) in the spring of 2010 during the longer period of Haiti relief and with the name of Humanity Road, with the intention of continuing to respond to the Haiti earthquake and then to respond to future disasters. Again, this is the study. This is the focus of study 3, and it refers to the same question. It looks back at that same question of how people are organizing during disaster to respond For this study, I did participant observation for 14 months, actually more now. It turns out to be hard to disentangle from this organization, but I've been with them now for 17 or 18 months as a participant observer within Humanity Road, so I'm a volunteer in the organization. And I study the group through their digital traces, which are the Skype chats, the Twitter messages, the Google documents, all save histories of their interactions. And so I can take notes in the moment, but I can go back and study all the interactions that we have over time. To give you a little overview, Humanity Road is an organization. They emerged from volunteering with the volunteers. Initially they were emerging, now they're more of an expanding organization, which is a different organizational type that presents after disasters. And I would liken them to a digital Red Cross in some ways. They're a purely virtual organization, although some members do know each other offline. They do almost all of their work, their coordination, their organizing in online spaces. They have a global workforce, people all over the globe. I think, depending on which day you count, there's either 4 continents or 5 continents in terms of our volunteers being located there. There's some flux with volunteers. People come and go a little bit, so it's sometimes hard to count. And this is different from some other virtual volunteer organizations because they are more developing. Humanity Road says they're the first 501(c), but there are actually other organizations out there like Crisis Mappers. Humanity Road's a little different in that volunteers are formal members of the organization. They go through training, they have ongoing roles, they sign up, and this is a little different, and they really consider themselves volunteers for Humanity Road. I'm going to take you through their mission statement just to show you some of the connections they have with the volunteers. Their mission is to educate the public before, during, and after disasters on how to survive, sustain, and reunite with loved ones. Humanity Road volunteers are trained and equipped to use internet and mobile communications technology to collect, verify, and route information online during sudden onset disasters. So we can see how that echoes the practice of the volunteers. This isn't a coincidence at all. You can see sort of how the practice of the volunteers becomes embedded in the mission statement of Humanity Road, of who they are and what they do. Using the internet, they provide public safety information as well. I don't talk as much about that in this talk. How they work, and I mentioned this a little up front, but they're almost purely virtual, and they work through probably hundreds of different tools, but there's 3 primary tools. And Skype for Humanity Road and a lot of the different virtual volunteer organizations, Skype is the main organizing tool. Skype would be like your virtual office. So we come here to the lab to do our work. They go into Skype to do their work. They show up on Skype and they start, who's here? What are we doing today? Skype's used for coordinating, training, teaching, organizing, socializing, planning what they'll do in the future. They use Twitter a lot. I'm not just saying that because I like Twitter and I've been studying Twitter a lot. Twitter is one of their main tools. They monitor Twitter for live information of disasters. They use it for outgoing crisis messaging too, to tell people how to respond to different disasters. It's their primary recruiting tool. That's how they recruited me, through Twitter. And it's not here, but they connect with other organizations over Twitter too. They've developed new connections. And they also use Google Documents a lot, which I talk about in the dissertation. I won't have time to reveal here too much of that. And we can see where that lines up with their mission statement. I'm going to give you a little tiny picture of what they do. This is not going to do justice to everything they do, but to give you a tiny picture, one of the things they do is they send out these messages during a crisis event to tell people how to respond. And they use these things they call tweetables, which are pre-crafted messages that they provide a spreadsheet of, so people can easily, volunteers can easily pick out ones that pertain to the disaster. This has a couple of purposes. One is it keeps everyone on the same message. So they all go to these approved areas to get their crisis messaging. And then it also provides new volunteers an easy way to enter. They can just select a tweet during a tornado and tweet it out. And they teach volunteers how to add the right hashtags to the end so people looking for that disaster will be able to see their information. Their most popular tweetable, one that they send out regularly through a tweet scheduler, is this one: verify twice, tweet once, rumors put lives at risk. They've begun to see themselves as the social media experts during disaster, and they see themselves also as educators, so they want to tell other people how to tweet during disaster. And this actually is similar to what the volunteer said in the comment about verifying earlier. We want to teach other people how to do this right. And so again, verifying is a huge part of what they do. Another thing they do is they synthesize information. So they try to pull information all into one source that someone during a disaster could use. So they search Twitter and things to find damage reports or reports of different impact or needs, and pull that in with also official information or pointers to official accounts. So they try to create these synthesized resources that people can use as a one-stop shop for information during a specific disaster. And I talk in the dissertation about a lot of different questions, but one of the big ones that's just really interesting to talk about is they have this issue where they said they're going to respond, their digital response, their virtual response, and they're like a Red Cross. Well, the Red Cross is sometimes limited by a local Red Cross chapter can only respond in their local area. And Red Cross also has their, for a larger event, they have to decide and answer some of these questions. But for Humanity Road, they could literally respond to every disaster. We respond to, digitally to disasters. So they have this question to figure out each time. So do we respond to an earthquake in Haiti? Well, maybe we do. Yeah, I think we do. Do we respond to a flooding in Pakistan? Okay, it's going to be harder. We don't have anyone who speaks the language, but maybe we can help. Do you respond to violence in Syria? Well, we could, but maybe we'll be in the way, or maybe we could cause some damage. So they're constantly negotiating what's within their realm, what's within the realm of digital volunteers, what's within the realm of digital volunteers that predominantly speak English. Although they have, sometimes they can respond in Brazil if they have a Brazilian volunteer. But so they've got all these sort of issues about what it means to do this kind of response work, which you could be in reality all over the place. And so they're just, like I said, constantly negotiating this, which is interesting to watch. So I'm going to step back here and pull back to this trajectory. So I've kind of gone through, and you can see how the different questions were answered by the different studies. And if we remember this first question, I was looking at computational solutions. This is the preliminary question. It doesn't actually pertain directly to the studies because the questions I end up answering were all human-centered solutions. So all of my studies are based on these human-centered solutions. Well, in the final study, I'm going to shift back halfway, and I'm going to talk about the possibility of a hybrid solution of using what we've learned from these human computation studies and what we know about digital volunteers to inform computational solutions that can work together to help out during disaster. And so research question 4 here proposes that hybrid solution. And research question 4 becomes the foundation for study 4. So let me read that. How does the larger crowd act to organize information through individual actions within the social media space? So sort of the things we've been looking at in individuals, how does that apply on the large scale? And how can we derive meaning from the collective work of the crowd? So this becomes the foundation of a Twitter study we did about the Egypt revolution in 2011. So if you don't remember, there was a provocative article written by Malcolm Gladwell in 2010. He said, "The revolution will not be tweeted." He was actually making an argument against determinism, which I totally follow with, but his statement here is a little overly provocative, and it turned out to be wrong, because not too many months later, social media, including Twitter, were used during the Arab Spring revolutions in Tunisia, Egypt, and actually across the Arab world. And in these mass disruption events, we see a similar convergence that we see in digital events, where we again witness global participation. And looking at what we'd known, we theorized that the global crowd was again working in a variety of different ways during these events, and we wanted to look at them. We did a huge Twitter data collection, over 2 million tweets, over 300,000 Twitterers. And in this case, we focused on information diffusion as a measure of crowd work. So I've been seeing all that retweet behavior, so we focused on the retweet. And what we started with was we identified the most retweeted Twitterers in this set, so the people that the crowd was retweeting their tweets the most. And we determined a location for a sample of those. And to give it all away right away, what we ended up finding, so we take a quarter sample of these 1,000 people that were most retweeted, and 30% of them were in Cairo at the time of the protests. And a large portion of those were in Tahrir Square during the protests. And so we have to figure that 30% of 300,000 Twitterers were not in Cairo during the protests. So what we have here at the most superficial level is the crowd is actually working to recommend locals through the retweet mechanism. The crowd, through their retweeting, is pointing at who the locals may be. And we wanted to extend that a little bit. So the crowd acts to recommend information through this identifying and amplifying information that we saw the volunteers doing. Well, this is something that happens in protests as well. They identify and amplify good information. And so they're recommending information, but it's not exactly in a straightforward way. I'm not going to have time to do this justice, but there's actually a difference between what the broader crowd is interested in and information that pertains to locals. And the crowd actually interacts with this type of information differently. And we ended up finding really quickly, the more retweeted a person was, the more likely that they were to be on the ground. The more followers they had, if they were highly retweeted, the more followers they had, the less likely that they were to be on the ground. Let me explain this. So if I'm in an event and I have a ton of followers, and all of a sudden, or it's during an event, and I tweet about Egypt and I have a ton of followers and I get tweeted a ton, it doesn't really mean anything. But if I only have a few followers, and all of a sudden I tweet about Egypt and I get a ton of retweets, that means I have something to say that's interesting about this event. And so I might be on the ground. And finally, through our empirical research, we realized another thing, and we tested this, it turned out to be true as well, that if you're retweeted for one thing a lot during an event, you're probably, even if I'm retweeted 1,000 times for one thing, I'm probably not on the ground. But if I'm retweeted for a lot of different things over the course of an event, I'm more likely to be on the ground than other people. So essentially we found out that the converging crowd can help us find information on the ground, and we can actually think about building tools to take advantage of this crowd work, collaborative filtering type tools. And so that sort of gives you an overview of the 4 studies and some of the major findings from each. And now I want to move to tying together some of these larger themes from across the different studies, and going to jump right in. So one of the things I've tried to do is sort of put together all the different things that I've been finding into a bigger framework. And as I've been doing that throughout this whole work, I've been unpacking this crowdsourcing term. So crowdsourcing is the popular term that they're using to talk about crowd work during disaster events. And I've been noticing a problem, actually it's a dual problem. One is the tendency to think of all crowd work as crowdsourcing, so everyone just slaps that term on it. And also there's been this other tendency to think of crowdsourcing as one very narrow form of crowdsourcing. So if you've ever been to a Chi conference and you go to the crowdsourcing talk, it'll all be about Mechanical Turk. And what Mechanical Turk does is it takes a problem that's really complex, and it turns it into thousands of different pieces, sends them out to separate members of the crowd. Each crowd completes their little task, maybe for 3 cents, maybe for something else, and then they put it all back together to get the answer. So you can talk about it as the assembly line of crowd work. But what I've been seeing with crowd work is way different from that, and far more collaborative and everything else. And so I'm thinking, where did we get this problem from with crowdsourcing? What's going wrong here? And so I go to Jeff Howe's website. Jeff Howe coined the term crowdsourcing in 2006, and then he wrote a book about it in 2008. And he's got 2 different definitions on his website about what crowdsourcing is. The top one, he says, in the white paper version, crowdsourcing is the act of taking a job traditionally performed by a designated agent, usually an employee, and outsourcing it to an undefined, generally large group of people in the form of an open call. Okay, that's one. So then in his soundbite version, his term, he says crowdsourcing is the application of open source principles to fields outside of software. And I'm going to contend that outsourcing business models and open source development principles are very different things. Very different ideas about what the crowd is capable of, how it works, and who it works for. And we've been seeing this shift towards thinking, so he's got both terms in there, but I've been seeing this shift towards people thinking of crowdsourcing as outsourcing. And what I saw actually was much bigger, and it's actually even bigger than this scale, but I can actually think of, I started to think about where all the work I saw would fit on sort of a spectrum between open source and outsourcing. And the first thing I realized is that they're totally missing because they're concentrating on systems and how systems create crowd work. They're totally missing emergent collective behavior, and a lot of what I saw in the mass disruption context was emergent collective behavior. And so I took this scale and I'm talking about these different things, but so emergent collective behavior is sort of like the volunteers. Open source is open source communities, but not doing coding, doing other kinds of activities. Virtual team sourcing is you have an outfit, maybe like Humanity Row, where you have a complex problem, you give it to them, and they figure out how they're going to do it. And then microtasking, where you have the problem and you tell people how they're going to do it, and you put it all back together. And then I kind of put the different studies that I did on this spectrum in different places. I'm not going to have a lot of time to explain it. Tweak-the-tweet translation is actually in 2 different places. And for most of it that I've described here, it actually was somewhere between emergent collective behavior and open source, all that translation activity. But if you remember the 4 people that were translating in a vacuum on their own, they actually kind of looked like microtasking if you look into that. Also, I noticed, and I talk about this in the dissertation, it's not just a spectrum. There's actually a drift in a lot of these communities they start drifting towards the more open sourcing model. There's some reasons behind that. It kind of makes sense, but it's interesting to see. It has to do with plugging into humanitarian response efforts and things. Sorry. So stepping back to get towards the end, I'm going to shift a little bit away from that and talk more about the bigger theoretical findings here. This relationship keeps showing up throughout my work, this relationship between the social structure that guides how we act. So when I say structure, it's like the rules that we follow, the routines we develop and enact, and the norms that we reinforce through by complying with them. This all fits into this idea of structuration, especially Orlikowski's version of structuration, where these 3 things are intricately tied together. In fact, they're mutually constitutive: technology, structure, and action. And as I'm doing this, I want structuration. It's a rejection of determinism. And sometimes I can talk about it. It might sound like determinism. I don't have a determinist viewpoint at all. In fact, some people say the technology caused this. Well, the technology did not cause digital volunteerism. In fact, I can look at one actor, Melissa Elliott, who early on in the Haiti earthquake was doing things that were fascinating, and people started copying her and developing into this. So I don't think digital volunteerism would be what it is today without her. And I think Humanity Road, again, is on the ground floor defining what it is. So their actions, though constrained by these technologies, are creating this new practice of digital volunteerism. And I think they're really on the ground floor. And the final thing I want to do, which I hope I have time for, but I'm going to take it anyways, is to try to tie this all together, to try to explain what was going on in this crowd through the lens of distributed cognition. And I'm going to show you it because it's easier to show you than tell you. But distributed cognition is a theory developed by Ed Hutchins, where cognition doesn't just exist in your head, but it's distributed in the environment. So it's distributed across social actors and across physical and digital resources. People talk of this idea of collective intelligence. What's happening here, collective intelligence? Well, it's kind of amorphous. I think distributed cognition gives us a way to illustrate and describe what collective intelligence is and how it works. An interesting place to start, which I learned when I watched Ed's class last year. He said this question over and over again, but you can sometimes start to look at distributed cognition through this question of what information goes where, when, and in what form. Another way to describe this as transformations of representation. So in this dissertation, I was often looking at Twitter, and I'm going to simplify here by looking at Twitter, but this actually extends past Twitter to other resources, social networks, and other things as well. But if you looked at the textual content of these tweets, and then you see all these transformations that the different volunteers were doing. They were filtering them, recommending them, routing them, verifying them. And through that activity, they were creating new representations. So you structured a tweet, and this kind of structure different from the other kind of structure. I'm sorry I didn't disambiguate better, but when you format a tweet with hashtags, you create a tweet, or you can geolocate a tweet and get it into a map. So all of these different transformations are happening. And here's an illustration I want to do of how I think this works, of how this all fits together, all these transformations enacting a distributed cognitive system. So if you think about this, I'm just going to use Twitter here because it's easy. Again, it's distributed much further. But I want to imagine these are all Twitterers, and it's after a disaster. And the red Twitters are people that are affected. The green Twitterers are digital volunteers that have already started to act as digital volunteers. And the yellow are response agencies. And they're all connected. They've got, not they're all connected. There's some underlying connections there. And after an event, somebody who was affected decides to tweet out information that her house has been damaged. And she sends out a tweet, but she's not very well connected. But one of the people that hears her tweet after she broadcasts it, one of the people decides to relay that tweet. So pass it on, so retweets it. So this person retweets the tweet out to a few more people, so it expands the scale. Then another person who sees that tweet decides to add a hashtag, JV Tornado. So he knows that this hashtag is being used. The Joyville Tornado tag is what's being used to talk about this event. And so that structures the tweet and actually allows it to get further because of the way Twitter works. People doing searches on that hashtag will now be able to see it. So quite a few more people see this information. And now they see it and they decide to pass it on. So you can see this information getting amplified, how it gets amplified in the system. After that, let's say a digital volunteer decides to route it to a couple different places, including the JV Fire Department, which may be new to Twitter. They don't have a lot of followers, but all of a sudden someone's sending them this information. Someone else puts it into tweet the tweet format, sends it off to a tornado map. Someone else from maybe Humanity Road puts it into an event diary or something, so synthesizes the information. So we can kind of see, as we look at this, a map maybe to how a metaphor of how a single brain works, but it actually goes a little beyond that. But information moving across nodes that's getting, transformed in different ways, these transformations of representations. And you can sort of see this cognitive system that's socially and digitally distributed in a fascinating way. And one of the interesting things for me is to look at the network structure changes that happen afterwards, because all these connections, as I talked before, new people come into the space, new people become digital volunteers, these new connections are made. And I absolutely don't have time for this, but I hope you're going to let me do it. And it's going to take me 3 more minutes, and it might put me one over. But I want to tell you a story that explains this in an interesting way. So a few months ago, this happened after my dissertation was mostly written. A few months ago, a Humanity Road volunteer contacts me and she asks me to look into this incident of the Malo Hospital, the Sacré-Cœur Hospital in Haiti. And she tells me some of the backgrounds, but I begin to look through the digital traces of what happened. And so this was a hospital that after the Haiti earthquake, they weren't very affected. They were way up in the north. They had a little bit of damage, but they turned out to have a huge capacity. They already had doctors there, and they were able to get new doctors in. So they had a capacity for 100 people there, 100 beds, excuse me. And they didn't have any patients. And they couldn't get any patients. And they didn't know why. And they contacted the Red Cross and other people, and they came to look at the facility, and they said, they're too small. We need a hospital with thousands of beds because we've got all this stuff. But they say, and you're too far away, too, because we can't get there. And they say, well, but we've got these doctors, and you've got people waiting for weeks to get surgeries, and we can give them surgeries today. And so I talked to a guy from the hospital last week, which is why this really isn't in my dissertation, to confirm some of this. He said, sure enough, we couldn't get anyone to use our facility, and we had all this capacity. So we started using social media. And we put the information on forums, and you can see this. It's on CNN iReports. People were posting this information in the comment area of articles that were online about it. So all these people are posting this information, and it starts to get on Twitter. They didn't put it directly on Twitter, but it gets on Twitter. And I've gotten my little set over 600 messages about this hospital having capacity. And they started adding information. We've got a helipad. You can land on our helipad. The doctors are coming in. Here's contact information for Tim Traynor. The guy ended up calling by using the tweet because I had his contact information. We've got all this, stuff. And they start spreading it out. They're spreading it around. And finally, 5 days after the event, it sort of comes to a crescendo. So many people are talking about it. I've got a graph now. And the next day, the US Coast Guard delivers 9 patients to the hospital. The day after that, the US Coast Guard delivers 9 more. US Navy starts taking people in. People learn it's there. They start bringing people one by one, if they can, to the hospital. Within 3 days, they're asking for more cots on Twitter because they don't have enough space, and they're trying to expand into the backyard of the hospital, and they're expanding it, and they're full. But it takes 4 days. It takes 4 days, but it happens, right? So I have this Humanity Road volunteer. She goes, I want to know. I sent this tweet to the US Coast Guard, and I want to know if mine was the tweet that caused them to connect to the thing. And I said, well, I contacted the Coast Guard. Of course, they won't talk to me. I said, I do know that they were watching social media. I do know they were looking at Twitter. So I said, well, I can't say that, but isn't it cool? It's collective intelligence. It's this. They're passing off the information, and finally it gets to the people that need it, and they're able to connect. And this is what happened. All those different transformations and putting, people adding the phone number, people adding the GPS coordinates. It all worked, and it happened. And she wasn't too happy about that. But if you take one person out of that network, I think it still works. I think the information still gets there. If you take all these digital volunteers out of there, you take all this action that happened, it doesn't happen. Twitter didn't make that happen. Social media didn't make that happen. All these people with this new practice made that happen. And this is my first confirmation from the guy at the hospital. Social media, that action helped us get patients in there, and we saved lives. We did 800 surgeries, and most of those people survived. So for me, that was fantastic, and I haven't got it all. It's into my next paper because I was just able to finally contact those people. Don't have a lot of time for the conclusions, but discovery of the digital volunteer, this move from crowdsourcing to crowd work, thinking about crowd work and even collective intelligence on a larger scale as distributed cognition, and I also offer on your handout this idea of the crowd as an information processing system. And we've been talking about this for a while, of the different levels, all this activity is happening. So we've got some filtering, and then the next round of people do some more filtering, some routing, and then people are structuring it. And it's working through its way of different layers of both human power, and I think we can plug in computational power there as well, to move it up until we get these resources that people can use. And I point out in a couple places where we can actually take, like I did in that study 4, take what we know about what the volunteers are doing and build tools that learn from those activities, so we can actually magnify the effect of volunteers by using machine learning and plugging it in these different ways. And I talk in the dissertation about how we can plug it in different ways. And the end, it's certainly not the end for me. I keep finding new questions and interesting areas to go into. A lot of open questions. The one thing I do know is this remote crowd worker is going to continue to be a feature of crisis events. And I'm excited to see where this research takes me next, and I appreciate all of your help in guiding me here. So I want to say thank you to my fantastic advisor, Laisha Palin, my committee, John Bennett, Ed Hutchins, Michelle Jackson, and Clayton Lewis, my colleagues at Project EPIC, who have supported me in tons and tons of different ways, including data, and more data, and also Amanda, who was on the floor today running a cord out from the other room, and everyone else, and the National Science Foundation. So thank you.